One thing you can count on in wrestling is that friendships don't last for long. After all, with it being such a competitive industry, there's often no room for loyalty to those around you if you want to make it all the way to the top. And that's why there are so many examples out there of one-time friends turning on each other. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the duo which, in many ways, defines the term fight forever, that being Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. Of course, this one goes back way further than their days in WWE. No, it goes all the way back to Ring of Honor and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, where a young Kevin Steen was teaming up with the mentor of Sami Zayn, Jericho. Hell, in the mid to late 2000s, they were such a well-oiled unit they even managed to become ROH Tag Team Champions on one occasion and PWG Tag Team Champions on two occasions. That said, before all was said and done in these companies, Steen would turn heel on Jericho and start a lengthy feud between the pair which was so legendary it actually carried over into WWE as well. And that's because once Jericho passed away after rescuing children from a fire in an orphanage, if you believe one of the many stories out there about him that is, his protege Sami Zayn got the job with Vince McMahon's promotion and was there soon joined by Kevin Steen as well, albeit now under the name of Kevin Owens. How would their pairing fare out? Much the same as Steen and Jericho's had as it happened, because after an initial embrace during KO's first night in NXT, the two came to blows and began a feud over the brand's world title. Then, once that was over and they'd each moved up to the main roster, they'd continue to battle it out all the way up until 2017, at which point they joined forces as a heel duo. But even that wouldn't be the end of their problems, because by 2021, a new conspiracy theorist incarnation of Zayn started feuding with his old friend once more. And this feud only got more intense after the Quebec native became the honorary Uce of the bloodline. Thankfully though, as it stands right now at least, the pair are on the same page again, as once Zayn left the bloodline, he'd reform his old team with his buddy, and the two would go on to win the undisputed WWE Tag Team titles from the Usos in the main event of Night 1 of WrestleMania 39. That's right, it appears KO is capable of putting the past aside for the right person. That said, we've yet to find out if this will happen for him in another one of our next subjects, as when Owens turned on Chris Jericho in 2017, it left scars for the latter party, which may never be able to heal. Why was this? Well, because up until then, the two had a friendship so pure that fans couldn't help but cheer for them every time they came out to the ring together, even if they were being portrayed as dastardly heels. It didn't matter if they were screwing over Roman Reigns, cheating to keep the Universal title around KO's waist, or were just generally causing havoc for the babyface roster. People were so into what they were doing together that they couldn't bring themselves to boo. Seriously, in a time period where WWE wasn't at its most strong, this was a true oasis of quality television. And that's what made it hurt all the more when they eventually split then, even if they did so in the most entertaining way possible. How did it happen? Well, after Y2J had apparently gone a little too far in volunteering his friend for a title match against Goldberg, the Quebec native decided enough was enough and that he needed to get some revenge. But in order to get maximum impact from this revenge, he'd have to disguise it in a celebration of the pair's bromance, a festival of friendship, if you will. Yes, on the February 13th, 2017 episode of Raw, one of the most memorable segments of the modern era occurred when Jericho showed Owens how much he loved him by lavishing him with gifts, only for Kevin to end things by giving his partner a gift of his own, a copy of the list of KO, one complete with the demo god's name printed at the top of it. Then after that, he'd lay out his now former friend and set up what was supposed to be a main event bout between the two at WrestleMania 33. Unfortunately though, as we all know now, that match ended up getting jobbed out by being put on second, with this leading to Y2J feeling so disrespected that he'd leave WWE altogether to go become a founding member of the AEW roster just 2 years later. And it was there that he'd spend the early days of that company's life going to battle with NXT. The same show that gave us our next example of one-time friends turned bitter enemies, those being Jade and Roxanne Perez. Now, if you watch the early days of NXT 2.0, then you'll remember that of the many new talents who were introduced at this point, Jade and Roxanne Perez were right there among the most promising. Hell, when it came to the latter, she'd already made quite a name for herself out on the indies by then by serving as the inaugural Ring of Honor Women's World Champion in 2021. And with the two sharing similar personalities and goals for the future, it should have come as little surprise that they'd become fast friends both on screen and off. with them being so close that they soon decided to form a tag team and go on to win the NXT Women's Tag Team titles from Toxic Attraction in short order. Unfortunately though, the team wouldn't last for long after they won the belts because before they could even defend them, Jade turned on her partner in apparent jealousy over her ability to get a shot at the women's world title. And to make matters worse, when she was done laying out her now former partner, she'd do a Medusa in 1995 by throwing the tag belts in the trash. Obviously then, this left Perez hungry for revenge, something she set about getting in a series of bouts over the following months, the highlight of which was probably their Weapons Wild match at that October of 2022's Halloween Havoc. But while this may have marked the end of their program for the time being, it seems like only a matter of time until things kick off once more, as there's still a sense of unfinished business between the two. Does this mean they'll eventually clash again once they've been called up to the main roster? Probably. Of course, they'll naturally be compared to a lot of similar friends-turned-enemies pairings from Raw and SmackDown, so they'll have to bring their A-game. Pairings like Shawn Michaels and Triple H. Yes, two of the most powerful men in all of WWE today behind the scenes started out their runs as mere in-ring competitors whose only job was to put on a good match. Well, we say they didn't really have any backstage power at that point, but that isn't entirely true, as they were each part of the Clique. But when the other Clique members, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Sean Waltman, all left WWF in the mid-90s to go join WCW instead, it put the power HBK and the game had at their disposal at risk. So doing what they had to do to keep themselves in the position they were in then, they began partnering up in late 1997, with this partnership soon blossoming into a full-blown new stable named D-Generation X, which also included Chyna and Rick Rude. And with DX firmly establishing themselves as a top heel act during those early days, it meant Shawn and Hunter didn't have to worry about anyone else coming for their spots. But as with so many great wrestling friendships, this one eventually collapsed too, though in their case it would take until 2002 for such a thing to happen. And the reason for that is because between 1998 and that year, HBK was in temporary retirement with a severe back injury. That said, when he came back and tried to return to the top of the card once more, Triple H decided this couldn't be allowed as, in his partner's absence, he descended to the level of top dog himself. So that was why he laid him out at this point, starting a program between the two which would begin with a 5-star classic at that August SummerSlam, and which would continue well into the next year and beyond. Sure, like with Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn after them, the two Clique members would eventually join forces once more to have a D-Generation X reunion or two, but that doesn't erase the brutality of the bouts which they got involved in together during the early 2000s. And this wasn't the only time Shawn Michaels got involved in a bitter rivalry with another Clique member as it happened, because back in 1995, the same thing was taking place with two dudes with attitudes. Yes, we know it's the most painfully 90s name for a tag team to ever exist, but back then, it was a help rather than a hindrance when it came to getting the pairing of the Heartbreak Kid and Diesel over as a duo. Not that they needed a name in order to be popular with fans, however. No, all they needed was to step into the ring and show what they could do as a team. Sure, it's true that most of the good stuff they did inside of the squared circle came from Michaels, as Kevin Nash was always, let's say, economical with his moveset. But so long as he played the role of powerhouse bodyguard to HBK's high-flying highlight reel, that's all he really had to do. That was until he decided he no longer wanted to live in his partner's shadow, of course, and instead wanted to go after the WWF Championship. A belt he ultimately won in late 1994 when he beat then-champion Bob Backlund at a house show in Madison Square Garden in just 8 seconds. Of course, given the fact Shawn at this time believed he was the best wrestler in the world and was more deserving of the gold, that victory caused friction between them, and because of this, it wasn't long before things came to blows. How would such a thing play itself out? Well, after the current chief of NXT won the 1995 Royal Rumble, he booked himself a shot at Diesel in a WWF title bout at WrestleMania 11. And in the lead up to this then, the pair decided they could simply no longer coexist as long as the title was coming between them. Still, at least once the match was over and Big Sexy had come out the winner, they were able to get back on the same page again, with them at this point having a second run as a tag team, which even saw them go on to win the tag team titles. But what of another Clique member who became a tag team champion with an unlikely ally a few years later in 1999? How would that work out? Well, for X-Pac, it would be great right up until the point that he and Kane split and the Minnesota native was forced to endure the Big Red Machine's wrath. Before this though, things couldn't have been rosier, as following Kane's babyface turn towards the end of 1998, he'd found himself lost in the wilderness for a while with no one to guide him through this new world. and that's why he was so lucky he came upon Shawn Waltman soon after then, as Waltman was only too happy to take him under his wing and act as a brother in many ways. Hell, so great were the pair as a unit, they'd even win the WWF Tag Team titles on 2 separate occasions, once from Jeff Jarrett and Owen Hart, and another time from the Acolytes. Alas though, once D-Generation X reformed as a heel group in late 1999, it spelled the end for the Big Man Little Man team, as well for a while it looked like Kane might actually be inducted into the stable. In the end, X-Pac had to stay true to his original family. And so, that was why he not only kicked the Big Red Machine to the curb here, he also stole his kayfabe girlfriend. Truly, a more dastardly act could not have been imagined then, and so fans were only happy to watch on as the masked superstar spent the next few months trying to get his revenge, with all this culminating in them being involved in one final bout at WrestleMania 16. What happened after that? Well, we'd never see any more from X-Pac and Kane. Yes, this was one of the unfortunate times where after their split, the two never reunited, meaning all we've got left are memories of the good times they shared as one of WWE's best ever odd couple duos. But it could have been much worse. They could have grown to hate each other in real life, something which happened with our next pairing of friends turned enemies, the Mega Powers. Now, this is one any old school fan should be all too familiar with, as it was probably the greatest storyline of the Golden Era, the rise and fall of Hulk Hogan's alliance with Randy Savage. How did it all start? Well, after winning the vacant WWF title during a one-night tournament at WrestleMania 4, the Macho Man found himself sharing the ring with the man who'd come down to the ring to congratulate him, the Hulkster himself. And that led to a full-blown friendship blossoming between the pair, as over the months which followed, they formed the Mega Powers, the biggest supergroup tag team the company had ever seen at this point in time. Of course, given the fact he was always a secret heel, you could argue Hogan's main reason for doing this was so he could keep himself in the spotlight. And that worked out well for him, because over the course of the next year, he'd main event every pay-per-view WWF put out, all while Savage never got to defend his title by going on last in a single one. Needless to say then, this eventually caused dissension within the ranks, dissension which only got worse once Randy became convinced his tag team partner had lust in his eyes for Miss Elizabeth. And that was all allowed to bubble up to the point it eventually boiled over during the February 3rd, 1989 episode of the main event, when after being abandoned by his friend in the middle of a match, the Macho Man turned on Hogan and the Mega Powers formally exploded. But while this was sad for fans to see, it wasn't all bad, as we got a great match out of the aftermath. When at WrestleMania 5 a few months later, the Golden Era reached its peak with Randy Savage versus the Hulkster in the main event. Of course, no prizes for guessing that Hogan won this one to regain his WWF title, but as it happened, that still wouldn't be the end of their story, as 5 years later in WCW they'd pick right back up where they left off, with them spending the half-decade which followed feuding, partnering up, and then feuding all over again, multiple times over. And to make matters even more interesting, at this point their real-life relationship had fallen to such a point that they reportedly hated each other. So much so that Savage would cut a diss track on the 13-time world champion as part of his 2003 rap album, Be a Man. One thing which wasn't a wonder to behold though was the day our next pairing blew up, as fans were always happy to see them together. That said, at least when Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie did officially split, we got a great bout out of it. Yes, it was in May of 1998 that, seeking another shot at Stone Cold Steve Austin's WWF title, Mick Foley agreed to do anything Vince McMahon asked of him, including but not limited to destroying his real-life friend and by then former tag team partner Terry Funk in a hardcore match. And that was a particularly heartbreaking sight for fans to witness, because prior to this, they'd been such an effective unit, not only inside of the WWE, but also outside of it. Sure, even when they were elsewhere, they hadn't always been on the same page, something their barbaric showdown in the finals of the legendary 1995 King of the Deathmatch tournament showed. But once they were done tearing pounds of flesh off one another, they were always able to make up backstage and share a beer together. And the bond they created in doing so meant that once they reunited on WWF TV in late 1997 under the guises of Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie, they were a near unbeatable unit. But even if this unit led to them winning the World Tag Team titles at WrestleMania 14, in the end it would be the World title which tore them apart, as once Jack morphed into a heel Dude Love and went solo again, he no longer had any time for anyone who could hold him back, and that meant he'd have to destroy Funk in order to regain that #1 contendership spot, something he did with apparent glee on the May 4th, 1998 episode of Raw. And they wouldn't be the only pairing who parted ways that year either, as just 2 months prior the same thing had happened with our next two subjects. Who are we talking about here? Why, The Rock and Farooq, of course. That's right, back at the dawn of the Attitude Era, it was clear Dwayne Johnson was destined for big things as he had more natural charisma than just about anyone else on the roster. That said, he wasn't always over with fans. No, this didn't happen until he dropped his initial babyface gimmick and instead turned heel when he joined the Nation of Domination in the summer of 1997. Of course, despite everyone realizing how good he was at this point, The Rock was still forced to play second fiddle to the leader of the Nation, Farooq, something he became increasingly pissed off about as the weeks and months went on. Why was that? Well, in the Great One's eyes, it was he who deserved to stand at the head of the table of the faction, and so that was why, over time, he gradually began to undermine Ron Simmons more and more, particularly during one memorable backstage interview segment where he absolutely ethered him without uttering a single word. How would Farooq take to this? Not well, unsurprisingly. No, he'd grow just as frustrated with the future WWE champion as he were growing frustrated with him. And that continued to be the situation for a while, with fans wondering when it was eventually going to blow up and The Rock was going to usurp his mentor as the leader of the faction. Then came the March 30th, 1998 episode of Raw, the night where the People's Champion finally decided to make his move when he laid out Farooq and took control of the Nation for himself. A decision which he never looked back from as it happened, because come the end of the year, he'd be WWF Champion. Before he did that though, he'd have a series of showdowns with his by then former leader, the most notable of which probably came at that May's Over the Edge pay-per-view when he successfully defended his Intercontinental title against Simmons. But after that was done, it would be separate paths for the two, as The Rock went on to his aforementioned WWF title success, and Farooq was forced to reinvent himself as one half of the Acolytes alongside Bradshaw. At least the Acolytes, or the APA as they would become later known, stayed together for a long time after that though. Long enough that they were still around when our next duo started their own doomed friendship. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Rob Van Dam and Kane. Yes, his time with X-Pac wasn't the only friendship the Big Red Machine had, which ultimately came to a sad end. That said, in the case of RVD, things were slightly different this time, as it was the big man who turned heel and severed their union. Before he did this, however, they were riding high on 2003 Raw as World Tag Team Champions after they'd beaten both the Dudleys and Lance Storm and Chief Morley for the honor in a three-way bout. So given how successful they were and how much they gelled as a unit despite their apparent differences, what could have possibly happened to bring about their fall? Well, Kane took off his mask, and in the process reverted back to his old movie monster ways. That's right, once the future mayor of Knoxville lost a match to Triple H on the June 23rd episode of The Red Brand that year and was forced to remove his face covering as a result, he'd decide he no longer wanted to be aligned with anyone anymore. So that was why he turned on Van Dam at this point and abruptly severed any friendship which had blossomed between them, with such a move leading them to having two blow-off matches. First in a no-holds-barred contest at August SummerSlam, and then in a steel cage bout on the September 8th episode of Raw. And with Kane winning both of these, it left little doubt as to who the better man was, which was why after defeating his former partner for the second time, the Big Red Machine moved on to other things, leaving RVD to pick up the pieces by going after the Intercontinental title instead. But we guess we shouldn't be surprised things worked out that way because, as today's video has shown, it's the way things too often go in wrestling whenever a pair of performers strike up a friendship under such competitive circumstances.